Karen and Richard Carpenter, aka the Carpenters, were an enormously popular brother-sister music duo who first shot to international fame in 1969 with their classic ballad, Close to You. Throughout the 70s, they dominated the charts, highly successful albums and singles. Karen, in a lot of ways, was really the face of the Carpenters. She was the vocalist. She had a 1 in a million voice, resonated with listeners all over the world. Karen had an exquisitely beautiful voice. There was a quality to her voice that could convey multiple emotions within the same song. Even songs that were expressing joy could have an undercurrent of sadness, and vice versa. Her unique 3-octave range was extraordinary. But this is not to discount Richard Carpenter's contribution. And in many ways, he really was the driving force at the Carpenters. He was composer, arranger, and is responsible for, in collaboration with Karen's vocal, creating the unique Carpenters sound. In my personal opinion, I believe that Richard Carpenter is a genius, a musical genius. I think he was ahead of his time, despite their massive and enormous commercial success. Really struggled in their own time to be taken seriously as artists, to have the critics' respect, to have credibility. And they were certainly saddled with, unfortunately, the perception of being, in their own time, hopelessly uncool. They came onto the scene in the late 60s and early 70s, and popular music was really focused on rebellion, experimentation, social consciousness, and counterculture. In image, the Carpenters were none of that. The fact that they were a brother-sister duo probably contributed a great deal to this. And it's interesting because I don't think that even any of their biggest detractors would have denied the fact that they clearly had talent. But I think they also let their snobbery around their music and image really cloud their ability to be able to appreciate them as artists. And the struggle with their image was something that followed the Carpenters throughout their career. There's a lot of really great interviews, and they talk about the frustration and how confining it was. That was their legacy at the time. We've seen this evolve and change over time. Both Karen and Richard Carpenter were noted by those who knew that to both be extremely perfectionistic about their work. In fact, it's often said that hearing them live sounded exactly like listening to one of their albums. There was such precision and polish in every note, every performance, and one of the things that makes it so enduring. A major shift for Karen occurred when Richard told her that she was going to have to come out from behind her drum set when they were performing live during the ballads to give the audience a focal point during the performance. Karen had begun playing drums in high school, which was very notable because at this time in the late 60s, drums were not considered an appropriate instrument for a girl. So she had to push back a little bit against expectation to be given permission to play. As it turned out, she was a very naturally gifted drummer. She fell in love with the drums. She loved drumming. She absolutely started out in her musical journey as a drummer. In fact, at that point, nobody really knew that she possessed this amazing powerhouse voice. That was something that came out later when she began to collaborate musically with Richard, and they needed someone to provide vocals. No one foresaw then that she secretly possessed this amazing instrument. Karen often really thought of herself as a drummer who happened to sing, which again is ironic. So she had to really move out of her comfort zone to do this. To give a little bit of perspective on the dynamic in the duo, whereas Karen's musical talent didn't really emerge until she was in her teens, Richard's emerged right away. At a very young age, he showed himself to be a musical prodigy. So from the time he was a very young child, he was very focused on music, very disciplined about his music. Spent all of his time working on music. Whereas Karen, in contrast, sounds a lot more like a carefree kid who liked playing outside with the neighborhood children during childhood, whereas Richard was always kind of inside working on his music. The common perception as well, shared by childhood friends of Richard and Karen, is that there was seemingly a lot of preferential treatment given to Richard. Could have been because he showed this amazing talent at a young age, perhaps because he was a boy. This was the 1950s. It could have been a subconscious thing, but whatever the reason, that does seem to be a widely agreed upon perception that Richard was the golden child and the favored child, particularly by Agnes, their mother, starting when they were very young. In fact, it's often reported that the Carpenters left their hometown of New Haven, Connecticut, to move to Downey, California, which was a suburb right outside of Los Angeles, exclusively because as Richard got older, the family wanted him to be closer to the music industry. They absolutely believed that he was a musical prodigy, who could potentially have a very bright future in the music industry, geography being destiny. Richard Carpenter has always denied that perception. He says really the driving force of why they moved was because his father hated the cold in Connecticut. The matriarch of the family, Agnes Carpenter, was controlling, had not just maybe an inordinate amount of focus on Richard, but also she was seen as being domineering, controlling of her children, being enmeshed with her children, having poor boundaries. Even into their adulthood, she meddled in their romantic relationship to the point of sabotaging them if she didn't approve. The Carpenter children lived with their parents until they were in their mid-20s, despite at this time being global superstars who had been all over the world. When they actually did move out from their parents' house, they moved right down the street from their parents into a house that they were sharing together. So this was definitely a very close-knit family. Some people would say too close, and that's where I think we start to get into one of the threads of the narrative is the idea that they were close in a way that was oppressive. Maybe in some ways she didn't feel like she was in the driver's seat of her life because her mother was calling the shots for her, or her professional life was so tied into Richard being part of the Carpenters duo, which was a space where Richard is really in control of that ship and calling the shots. Now, beginning in the early 70s, really at the height of their phenomenal success, people began to notice some changes in Karen. She began to express a lot of concern about her weight. This wasn't exactly a brand new thing for her. She had shown concerns about her weight at different times in the past and dieted, but now that she was a superstar who had been kind of forced out from behind the safety of the drums and onto center stage, she began to express concern, told everybody around her that she was determined to lose weight and feel better about herself. She began to diet. She lost around 20 pounds. She got a lot of positive reinforcement for the weight loss, people telling her she looked great. To the people around her, there was a perception at the time of, okay, she wanted to lose some weight. She did. She looks good. End of story. Unfortunately, though, it wasn't the end of that story, and it wasn't that simple. As time went on, concerns began to arise about how thin Karen was becoming. People began to notice concerning patterns in her eating habits. She was never really seen eating anything other than salads and iced tea. People began to notice that when she was dining with others, she would engage in strategies such as moving her food over her plate or telling others how great her food was and asking them to take a bite. She also began to appear weak and fatigued. They were working hard, they were touring, they were traveling. It was a very busy time for them career-wise. Perhaps she was just tired and run down, that maybe had overdone it a little bit with the dieting. She received brief medical treatment for this. 70s rolled on. Karen became alarmingly thin, to the point where people around her were deeply worried. They were also deeply confused. Really important to note here that at this time, eating disorders were not a well-known thing. It wasn't a concept people were really familiar with, and there wasn't an extensive amount of treatment for it either. So to a large degree, the people in Karen's life didn't have the resources to understand that she was suffering from an eating disorder. Sounds like a lot of people had well-meaning, but ultimately very unhelpful solutions for her. You just need to eat and everything will be fine. Not really understanding that treating an eating disorder is far more complex than that. As the 70s came to a close, although the Carpenters maintained a devoted fan base, remained popular, time was moving on. Culture was changing. The music industry was changing. What sold was changing. The Carpenters, by this point, had really stopped touring altogether to focus more on doing TV special. And it was around this time that Richard shared with Karen that he was struggling with an addiction to Quaaludes. This was something that had started innocently with him as a prescription to help him sleep, but it had gotten out of hand. He recognized he had a problem, and he wanted to get treatment for it so he could get better and move on with his life. In order for him to get treatment, this required him taking a step back from their career in the Carpenters, which was the first time that had ever happened. At this point, they had consistently worked nonstop for years, so it was a really abrupt change for Karen to have him take a break from it. How she decided to fill this time was something that started out as an exciting adventure for her. She decided to go to New York, record her own solo album with legendary music producer Phil Ramone. She and Phil Ramone worked hard and diligently. However, when they presented it to Richard and Herb Alpert of their music label A&M Records, the reception was not that warm. The label and Richard didn't feel that the work was strong enough. Ultimately, Karen ended up deciding to shelve the project. And the idea that she and Phil had was to do something that was completely different from the Carpenters sound. They didn't want to make something that sounded like a Carpenters knockoff. The goal was to really take her in a different direction as a solo artist. And as a result of that, the songs were more mature, more sexual in nature, and reflective of the kind of pop, disco influence sound that was really popular at the time. Richard Carpenter did eventually end up releasing that album after he had polished it up. Richard has always maintained that in the end, it was 100% Karen's decision not to release the record, and that she was in agreement with their critiques of it. By his own admission, Richard Carpenter was an absolute musical perfectionist. He also was very attuned to working with Karen's voice. He really felt like he knew how to work with it to bring out the best qualities. There may have been a little bit of apprehension about how people would respond to a more adult album from Karen. The Carpenters were just in a very unenviable position with their image of kind of being damned if they did and damned if they didn't. For example, in their beautiful ballad song, Goodbye to Love, they introduce a fuzz guitar solo in the middle of this ballad. Nowadays, that's such a common thing. We're so used to the power ballad that doesn't seem risk-taking at all. But at the time, it was really unheard of. The diehard Carpenters fans felt like they were selling out. They're trying to sound like hard rock, devil's music. Whereas critics and non-Carpenters fans, oh my God, look at this. They're trying to be cool. They need to just stay in their lane, which is a real shame because that's an amazing song. Another significant thing that happened in Karen's life in the early 80s was her wedding to Tom Burrows. In trying to get a handle on what Karen's personal life may have been like before her wedding, there are some accounts that really give the impression that she really didn't date, that she really had no love life to speak of until she met Tom Burrows. By other accounts, Karen did date and have relationships throughout her adulthood. Several of these men have come forward and talked about that. She was also linked with having dated some famous people: Steve Martin, Tony Danza, Mark Harmon. Another thing that's worth noting is that people who were close to Karen say, first of all, she absolutely wanted to get married and have children. More than anything, that was what she wanted. She had a great fear of somebody only marrying her for her money and her fame. And it was very important to her to marry somebody who was independently wealthy themselves. Now, when she met Tom Burrows, he presented himself as very wealthy. Karen was absolutely charmed very early on. People in her life were a little concerned. They felt like he was a little too good to be true, a little too charming, a little too slick. And they were also wary of the fact that he immediately wanted to get married, pushing for this right after they met. I think it was the type of thing where people's radars went off a little bit. But on the other hand, they really wanted Karen to be happy. The wedding was huge and very lavish. One thing that has been revealed is that according to Karen's friends, shortly before they were to be married, Tom confessed to Karen that he had had a vasectomy, which felt like a huge betrayal to her because he was aware of how much she wanted children. He indicated he wanted the same thing. So to find this out felt like a real betrayal. And it's reported that Karen called her mother devastated and hysterical and not knowing what to do, wanting to call off the wedding. Agnes's response was, "We can't do that. We've already spent too much money on this. People are coming. We can't have the embarrassment, the public embarrassment of calling it off. We're just going to have to go through with it and then figure it out." In the end, Karen did go through with the wedding, but the happiness was short-lived. In very short order, it became apparent that Tom had misrepresented his wealth, was borrowing large sums of money from Karen, and also engaging in a pattern of behavior that many people in her life considered to be abusive. The people closest to Karen were very relieved when the marriage eventually fell apart. It was at this time where Karen really began to be more open with people about her eating disorder. At this point, she had become familiar with the concept of anorexia nervosa, which she was able to identify that she was suffering from. And she became serious about wanting to get treatment. Her family really encouraged her to go a medical route and check herself into the hospital. But she was more focused on the idea of anorexia as more of a psychological disorder, which is not exactly what we believe about it today, but was very much what was believed about it at that time. But one of the single most lacking things in treatment of eating disorders at that time, there was no integration of treatment. And what I mean by that is that The ideal treatment today would absolutely be something multidisciplinary. A medical doctor, a nutritionist, a mental health provider. It's understood that this is a complex diagnosis and that the treatment has to be multifaceted. It's also understood the great medical risk that someone who suffers from anorexia is under. It's absolutely essential to have a medical doctor involved in treatment. The prevailing belief at that time was that eating disorders were 100% a psychological disorder. A young woman, usually from an affluent family that places high expectations of perfectionism on their children, who is struggling with the desire to want to have control over something in their life. And the pattern of withholding food for themselves becomes not only a way of maintaining control, but also a way of working toward a perfectionistic, unrealistic standard of the ideal body of thinness. A lot of that was derived from the idea that that was primarily what the typical client who was seeking treatment looked like at that time. It's not necessarily that that is an invalid interpretation, but it is a very incomplete one. For starters, it's very important to note that anorexia affects people of all demographics, all ages, all genders, all races, from all parts of the world. Well, there certainly can be a correlation between perfectionistic personality traits, family dynamics, and body image. Correlation is not causation. And these may be traits that we legitimately and accurately see occurring with some people with this diagnosis. It's by no means the full picture. What we do understand better now is that there are neurobiological and genetic factors that play into this that give somebody a predisposition. A lot of times we also look, and rightfully so, at the way that our media idolizes unrealistic expectations of thinness and body image. And that's a very valid factor to look at. However, we also see evidence of anorexia having been detected and documented as far back as the Middle Ages. The truth is, we don't really know what causes anorexia. We know there's something different in brain biology. We don't know exactly what it is. It's very similar to addiction in this case. It's well understood that genetics and neurobiology play a part in addiction. We don't really know what's different in the brain of the addict. We don't really know exactly what's different in the brain of the anorexic. We just know something is. I think that's really important to note, because I think when we look at Karen Carpenter and how people interpret her life, Agnes and Richard Carpenter are really made the villains of the story, are really blamed for why Karen developed an eating disorder. And I just want to be careful about how I present that or talk about that, because, well, I absolutely think as a therapist that factors like family dynamics can play into why somebody develops the mental health symptoms they had. That doesn't necessarily mean full causation. Most of the time, I think we're really looking at a complex array of things. And I don't really think it's fair to say, this is your mother's fault. I can concur, based off of the ample evidence, that Agnes Carpenter likely was domineering and controlling. I can concur that there was visible favoritism toward Richard, and that personality-wise, Agnes Carpenter was not known for being emotionally demonstrative or warm. I also think that that doesn't mean that she didn't love her children. I do think from the outset there's plenty of evidence that this was a close-knit family who cared about each other, which brings us to the point of Karen's therapeutic treatment. At the time, Karen wanted who she thought would be an expert, who she chose was a licensed therapist named Stephen Levenkron. At a time when the mental health treatment field did not have many people who specialized in eating disorders, Stephen Levenkron was someone who was gaining some notoriety and attention for his work with anorexia. He had written a young adult fiction novel entitled The Best Little Girl in the World. This was also subsequently made into a pretty well-remembered TV movie starring a very young Jennifer Jason Leigh. So on the strength of that book, which was introducing people to the concept of anorexia, to the symptoms of anorexia, Karen selected him. She had initially thought of this as something that she could do in a matter of days. However, when he informed her that this was going to be a longer process, she relocated to New York so that she could get daily therapy from him. Stephen Levenkron is actually still practicing in New York today. His work was based off of the idea that the anorexic's relationship with control is kind of at the heart of the problem. So he worked with a model that involved the therapist having the control and authority in the dynamic, and that through the course of treatment, control is gradually given back to the client. as a means of helping them feel more self-trusting and empowered. It's really rooted in more of an earlier approach to psychotherapy that was more psychodynamic, more Freudian, more clinical, more detached. Cron, I do want to say this about Levin Cron. He was a licensed professional. There's an idea that because he couldn't save Karen, therefore the therapy was bad or the treatment was bad. And I think it's worth noting that although certain things about that approach maybe haven't aged well, they were rooted in the ideas of what was believed to be most effective for eating disorder treatment at the time. Given the advanced state of Karen's illness at that time, by contemporary standards, she absolutely would have been treated in a hospital. He didn't misrepresent his credentials. He was a licensed therapist. He had expertise and training to be practicing therapy. He was working with the best known models at the time. Unfortunately, therapy can't always save people. It sounds like there was trust in this professional relationship. Karen was open with him about things like her overuse of laxatives, the fact that she was taking a thyroid medication despite not having a thyroid problem in order to control her weight. When she finally did begin to experience physical symptoms, she told Levin Cron about this, and he had her hospitalized. In the hospital, she very quickly gained back 30 pounds. At the time she was released, she was reported to feel hopeful, optimistic about the future, optimistic about being healthy. On February 4th, 1983, Karen Carpenter died of a heart attack. In the years that have followed, one of the prevailing theories about what happened is that her death may have been related to complications from use of syrup of Wikipedia. The tragedy of Karen's death absolutely brought awareness about anorexia and eating disorders to the public. I think the attention that Karen's death brought to it absolutely saved lives. And so her role in expanding the public's knowledge of it is part of her legacy. As years went on, the Carpenters' legacy did begin to evolve and grow and change in interesting ways, in ways that kind of took them beyond that kind of square goody two-shoes image that haunted the first part of their career, helped them to gain artistic credibility and to be appreciated for the innovators that they were. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you've been patient enough to stay with me through this video, I love you. Please leave your thoughts and comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. If you have any thoughts on Karen Carpenter or anything that we talked about in this video, I want to hear them. If you have any thoughts for future videos or things you'd like to see, I've gotten some really fantastic suggestions from some of you. So I've got some videos in the works based off of those suggestions. So I love to hear that. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.
It doesn't have to end here. Click on one of the videos below for all this and more. And we'd love to have you like, share, and subscribe. And maybe even join so we can put some more gas in this thing.